Okay then, welcome everybody to our 79th Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. This week we're very pleased that we've got one of our own presenting, which is always a pleasure. We've got Sarah Jewell from the University of Reading presenting on cricket. And I don't have the title to hand, unfortunately, shoddy preparation. But before we get going, one thing to mention that Thomas asked me to mention, Thomas and Jan are here, and with the recent ominous looks of the Omicron variant plus the Delta variants spread still around mainland Europe, their conference that they planned for 11th of February next year in person will now take place a little bit later. The plan is still to be in person, but maybe in April or May. So watch the space for that, and hopefully soon we will be meeting in person, but maybe just a little bit later. So watch out for news from Thomas and Jan about that conference. The other thing to mention is that in 2 weeks' time we won't have a Roses talk. There may be an in-person conference in here on that day again. The travel restrictions may change between now and then, but the 15th Sport Economics Conference in Nihon is 2 weeks today. And with that, we won't have a Roses talk. Arnaud Chevalier was going to talk about fantasy football that week, research based on fantasy football, but he'll now talk in April on that research instead. So that's a couple of administrative notices. So now, Sarah, if you're ready, please do take away your talk on home bias and international cricket.
Yeah. So I've just got to find
the right window.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Okay. Can you see?
Can see it. Looks good. If you want to go on full screen.
Yeah, I haven't gone full screen yet. I just want to make sure you can see it, but you can see it.
Got it. Yep.
Okay. So let's go. Okay. So I can't see anything. So please feel free to interrupt me at any point if anyone's got any questions or if there's any issues. If you can't, so for example, if you can't hear the videos that I'm going to play later, just let me know. Okay, so I'll get going. So this paper, given that James didn't have the title, it's at the moment, but it's very, very preliminary work, and hence comments, suggestions, feedback are going to be very welcome. So the title is, Can Awareness Reduce or Even Reverse Home Bias? Evidence from International Cricket. So I suspect the title is going to change as the work progresses. So this is joint work, and Carl might be able to answer some of any questions in the chat. So what we're interested in this particular, oh, I've got an echo. Sorry. I'll try again. I think that's better. Yeah, so what we're interested in doing in this paper is exploiting a regulation change that took place as a result of the pandemic in cricket. There were several changes, and I'm going to talk through the changes a little bit later, but the main change was the return to 2 home umpires. So in cricket, there are 2 home umpires. So effectively, these are like the referee in other sports. So prior to 1994, there used to be 2 home or 2 local umpires, and as I mentioned, as a result of the pandemic, cricket returned to this. So therefore, we were interested in seeing, okay, what was the result of this? And I'll talk a little bit more why this is interesting as we go along. So I'm sure you're all aware that as a result of the pandemic, a lot of sports had to play behind closed doors, and this absence of a crowd obviously was of great interest to sports economists who are interested in looking at home advantage. So there's a large number of papers that are looking at this, in particular trying to separate out official bias, specifically trying to separate out favouritism versus the social pressure of crowds. So there's a lot relating to football, and I'm not going to summarise all of this, and a number of papers relating to US sports. So this isn't quite a paper that's specifically focused specifically on what happens if we remove crowds. It's much more focused on this move to, or return, should I say, to home umpires. And it is worth noting that cricket, well, I think cricket is very attractive to economists. It has a long history. We have score cards dating back to the 1800s. The game is quite discrete, so compared to other sports in particular, it's quite easy to measure or separate out individual and team performance. So cricket love their statistics, so there is a wealth of data. And another attractive feature of cricket is there is this degree of randomness. So the weather, for example, can be really important in cricket, and there's also a coin toss that determines whether a team or who determine who bats first. So I know that many of you are not familiar with cricket, so I will need to spend a little bit of time sort of explaining the basics of cricket and the key aspects that are important for our paper. So there will be quite a lot of scene setting, so do bear with me, but hopefully it will help understand the results a little bit easier. So cricket is a game that's played by two sides of 11 players each. So the basic aim of the game is to score more runs than your opposition. So teams will take it in turns to bat and bowl. So when a team is batting, players will bat in pairs. A cricket pitch will have a wicket. Either end of the wicket are some stumps, which will have some bails on. So there will be a batsman at either end. Bowlers will be bowling from one end to a batsman, and to score runs, batsmen have to run from one end to the other, or they can hit the ball over the boundary, which will also enable them to score runs. So the game consists of a series of innings, and the number of innings is really depending on the format. So we are particularly interested in the longer format that can take place up to 5 days. So at international level, this is known as Test cricket. There are also shorter formats which take place over limited overs. And at international level, these are typically 50 overs or 20 overs. And we will be comparing Test match cricket to the 50 over game at international level, which is known as one-day internationals. So an innings will end when all 10 wickets have fallen. So there are 11 batsmen. So obviously the 11th batsman will run out of partners. Or in the case where we have limited overs, when all the allotted overs are completed. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the game, but I do want to talk a little bit about the modes of dismissals, so the ways that wickets can fall, because this is important to what we're interested in. So there are officially 9 ways of getting out. Anybody who is familiar with the game of cricket, there used to be 10, but handling the ball is now considered obstructing the field. So I'm not going to bore you and go through all the obscure ways of getting out. I just want to point out some of the key ways of getting out. So when batsmen are batting, not only are they trying to score runs, they're also trying to defend the wicket. So the stumps behind them. So when the ball is bowled, if it knocks the bails off, so it hits the stumps and knocks the bails off, this is known as bowled, and the player is out. The fielding team, so the team that are bowling, the fielding team, can also remove the stumps if the batsman is out of their crease. So if they're attempting a run and the bails are removed, then this is known as a run out, or if they come out of their crease and the bails are removed, typically by the wicketkeeper who stands behind the stumps, and this is known as stumped. Another key dismissal mode is caught. So if the ball goes up in the air, then and is caught before it touches the ground, then the batsman is out. Now, the key one that we're interested in is the LBW, because the LBW relies on various criteria, so it does require on the umpire, the official's judgment. So I'm going to show you a video very shortly to explain the Lbw rules, and so that you can visualize it. But it's just worth noting that the modes of dismissals that I've mentioned, caught, run out, stumped and LBWs, are common modes of dismissal which technology might be used for to help aid that decision. And I'll talk a little bit more about technology shortly. But now I'm going to get Stephen Fry to explain the Lbw for you. And please let me know if this sound's not working.
Leg before wicket. Lbw. Lbw is a little like the offside rule in football. Many people claim to know it, but how many people really do? Our handy checklist means that whether you find yourself umpiring an international test match or the kids on the beach, your reputation for fairness will remain intact. There are 5 basic criteria to consider. The batsman is out, leg before wicket, if 1. The bowler bowls a ball that isn't a no ball, unlike this poor fellow. 2. The ball, if it is not intercepted on the full, pitches in line between wicket and wicket or on the offside of the batsman's wicket. It cannot be out if the ball pitches outside the line of the leg stump. 3, the ball hits the batsman either full pitch or after pitching and before he hits it with his bat. 4, this is where it gets a bit more complicated. If the batsman was making a genuine attempt to play the ball, the point of impact must be between wicket and wicket for Lbw to be an option. However, if the batsman has made no genuine attempt to play the ball, the contact must either be between wicket and wicket or outside the line of the off stump. 5. This is the crucial part. But for the interception by the batsman, the ball would have gone on to hit the stumps and dislodge the bails. Any questions? Just refer to Law 36 in the Blue Book.
Okay, so hopefully that makes some sort of sense. But I think the key thing to take away from this is there is a number of criteria, and the criteria, well, I guess there's room for making mistakes, and potentially, particularly for marginal calls, there might be, I guess, tendency or for umpires potentially to maybe be swayed by social pressure, by the crowd, or again, consciously or unconsciously favour one side or the other. If this. Okay, so it's important to talk a little bit about technology because Lbw decisions in particular can be reviewed by a third umpire known as the television match official. So as mentioned, there are 2 on-field umpires. They alternate every over. So in cricket, 6 balls are bowled by a bowler in a row, and that's known as an over, and then another bowler takes over. So after every over, the umpires will switch over. So one makes the decisions, whereas the other one will be standing on the pitch effectively as another pair of eyes. So there is also a third umpire, and the third umpire has been around for a long time. Cricket has been using technology and it was quite ahead of its time relative to other sports, since around 1992. So originally technology was used to aid just the on-field officials, so they could only ask for a piece of action to be referred and to look at the evidence, to look at various camera angles, etc., for clean catches and for run-outs and stumpings. But in 2008, cricket introduced a decision review system where players can refer decisions themselves to a third umpire. So if they think that a decision is incorrect, so if the bowling side thinks it should have been given out and it hasn't been given out, they can refer it. And if a batsman thinks it's been given out and he thinks he's not out, then he can refer it. Each team are allowed a certain number of unsuccessful reviews. So prior to the pandemic, they were allowed in Test match cricket 2 referrals, and in the shorter form, in the one-day internationals, they were allowed 1 referral. So if a decision is shown to be, and there needs to be clear evidence to overturn the decision. If the decision is overturned, they will keep the review. If it's not overturned, then they lose the review. But there is one situation where if this decision is very close, known as umpire's call, and this represents that the technology has a margin of error. If it's so-called umpire's call, and I'm going to show you another video to demonstrate what this is, then they also get to keep the review. So umpire's call represent sort of marginal decisions rather than what the system is designed for. The system is designed to overturn clear and obvious errors, which would be known, what we would call shockers. So there is a little bit of evidence or a little bit of research that has looked at this DRS, the decision review system. So Gregory and Smith et al. Showed using, focusing on LBW decisions, and we will be focusing on LBW decisions in our analysis, that DRS can reduce the potential bias of decisions that favour the home team. The Shivakumar 2018 paper looked at decisions that had been referred and found no difference in the likelihood of an LBW or a court decision being overturned if it was reviewed by the home or away team. So now I just want to show you, I'm not going to show you the whole video, I'm just going to show you parts of the video just so that you can sort of understand the DRS and the controversy, or the perceived controversy around it. So
yeah, we're going to do DRS not because Stuart Broad is in the studio, but because of what Coley said. And when Coley says something, it reverberates around the world. He said it is confusing, the umpire's call. And I've heard this from a variety of people. I think Shane Warne thinks it's confusing. I just want to try and explain why we have umpire's call. And as I just said, with any law change you make or technology change, it has repercussions down the line. So the reason DRS was brought in was because you wanted to get rid of the absolute shocker. I'm going to give you an example of an absolute shocker. Alex Stewart batting in Gaul against Sanath Jayasuriya in 2001. Remember that if a ball pitches outside leg stump, you shouldn't be given out LBW. This was pre-DRS. And if you look at the tram lines on the replay, forget poor old Gaffer's reaction, but you look at the tram lines, this is an absolute shocker. And if you had DRS back then, it would immediately been reviewed and it would been overturned. We saw 2 today with Rishabh Pant, immediately great use of DRS. So DRS has been a success, but the repercussions has meant that it's changed the game for spinners. In our day, if you played off the front foot, you would never be very...
all the intricacies. So I'm going to now move on to umpire's call.
And it is a good one. The problem with DRS and the confusion is you'll have 2 balls, both hitting the stumps. One will be not out and one will be out. And how do you explain to anyone new in the game that a ball that's shown to be hitting the stumps predictively is going to be not out? And here are those 2 examples. Dominic Sibley batting against Embaldiniya in Sri Lanka. This ball, the prediction from Hawkeye, from the technology, says it's clipping, but it's not out because of the umpire's call. And then the very next 2 deliveries later, we look at Johnny Bairstow. Virtually the same delivery is going on to clip the stumps and is given out on review. They review it and it's given out. Just like that. And that's the confusion that Kohli is talking about. How can you have those two? Virat said if a ball's hitting the stumps, it is hitting the stumps, end of. But actually, Virat, that ball has never hit the stumps. That is a prediction. The ball has hit the pad. The technology, with its range of error in there, is predicting that it might well hit the stumps. It never actually hits the stumps, and that's the difference. And that's why you need the margin of error, and that's why you need the umpire's call. It's not there to back up the umpire. It's to give the margin of error for the technology. If you didn't have that and you had umpire's call as out, right? So let's say the predictive element tells you it's hitting there, just clipping. All right, it could be just here, 2% margin of error. It could be just wide, a 2% margin of error. That means that immediately your stumps are higher and wider, and that is a massive target now for your pad. And I am going to, as a captain, when I see something like that, I'm getting Stuart Broad to appeal for everything. I am reviewing everything, and umpires will give virtually everything out because they think it will be clipping, and we will have more 2-day test matches like we've recently seen. It will move those stats I've shown you even more in favour of LBW.
I've never seen Broad so happy sat watching you.
Okay, so the important thing with umpire's call is whether or not, or the important thing is it depends on the decision on the field. So if a batsman is given out and it's umpire's call, then the decision will remain. If the decision's not given out and it's reviewed, then the decision will remain not out. So as was mentioned, you could have 2 identical sort of balls. One will be given out, one will not be given out, based on whether or not the on-field umpire gave it out. So these are what we would refer to as the marginal calls. So because there is some degree of error with the technology, then this is why this exists. But then if we're interested in bias of officials, then we've got to be aware of these sort of marginal decisions and whether or not close calls might be more inclined to go to one team or the other. Okay, so I spent quite a lot of time sort of explaining a little bit about cricket and a little bit about DRS and umpire's call. So now let's sort of move on to what we're actually trying to do in this paper. So sorry for taking so long to set the scene, but I think it was important that you understand these things. As a result of the pandemic, cricket was suspended in March 2020, and in June 2020, the International Cricket Council announced some interim regulation changes given the imminent return of Test match cricket. So the key change, and this is what we're interested in, is that prior to the pandemic, there were 2 non-home umpires officiating in tests, though in one-day internationals there was only a requirement for 1, so they could have 1 home umpire. So this was relaxed because they wanted to reduce travel. So this led to a return to 2 home umpires, 2 local umpires. A second change was now, because they're selecting, umpires are chosen from an elite panel of umpires. So if you're only selecting a local umpires, that reduces the pool. So the ICC were concerned that there would be less experienced umpires officiating tests, or less combined experience between the two on-field umpires. So they introduced an extra referral. So for tests, this went from 2 to 3 referrals for a team in an innings, and from 1 to 2 in one-day internationals. I mean, it might be the case that they were worried about home umpire bias, for example, and that's why they introduced it. But the reason given was this reduced experience. There was also another change, and that was the ban of applying saliva to the ball. So you might think, why are players spitting on the ball? So in cricket, it is very common to shine one side of the ball. So players will rub the ball on their, often on their trouser leg, because the idea is by shining one side of the ball and making the ball uneven, you'll get the ball to move in the air, known as swing. And this makes it's meant to make taking wickets easier. And for some reason, applying saliva to the ball is supposed to aid this process. So for obvious COVID-related reasons, this was banned. So what impact this will have is something we need to think about carefully. So one might argue that this might favour the home team. They're more familiar with the conditions, so they'll have a better understanding of how to play cricket without where there will be less swing. Or the other argument might be that away sides might be not as good at playing swing in these conditions, and hence it might even things up. Now, the red ball that is used in the Test match cricket swings a lot more than a white ball, which is used in one-day internationals. And one-day internationals, they have 2 balls, one either end, and it's obviously shorter format. So we think that any effect of the applying saliva to the ball will have a lot less impact in one-day internationals, and one of the reasons why we want to compare results to one-day internationals. Like other sports, we will observe matches behind closed doors and some with crowds. So again, we want to be interested to see differences between, or essentially when we have social pressure from crowds versus no social pressure from crowds playing behind closed doors. It's worth noting, for those who are not familiar with cricket, cricket don't allow substitutions. Well, they do actually allow fielding substitutions. So when the team is fielding, if a player leaves the field, strictly it's meant to be for illness or injury, but teams do bend this slightly if they need to go for a comfort break. You are allowed a fielding replacement, but you're not allowed a replacement for batsman or a bowler, except if a player is concussed, and they also allowed this if a player was to test positive for COVID-19. But I don't think this ever happened. So it is this move back to the return to the home umpires that we are particularly interested in, but we need to be aware of the other changes because this might impact our results. And again, this is something we need to think through. So just a quick reminder, though I'm sure you don't need reminding, what the literature says about why there seems to be a home advantage. One reason is potentially home crowds. So crowds spur on their home team. We're interested in specifically the bias of officials. So there's the favouritism versus the social pressure of crowds argument. So why the pandemic leading to playing behind closed doors was so useful is it allows research to sort of separate out these two effects. Another reason potentially is being familiar with conditions, and this is very true in cricket. So cricket conditions vary not only across countries, but also within countries across venues. So in our estimations, we will be using venue fixed effects. So this could be a strong reason for why there might be home advantage in cricket, particularly in the longer format of the game. Another potential reason is away team travel fatigue. It should be noted in cricket, teams at the international level, teams will go on tours, so they might be away for a long period of time. So it's difficult to sort of assess how this might impact sort of cricketers. One imagines a long tour, they might start to tire, but also they might start to get familiar with conditions. And it should be noted that in the pandemic, teams were placed in bubbles. And in fact, often the away team having to come over and quarantine, they often had more preparation than the home team did. So, again, we're interested in this return to home umpires. And as I mentioned, sort of in passing, this had been the case before. So the background is prior to 1994, the norm was to have local umpires in Test cricket. But there was a concern that these umpires couldn't be neutral, not to say that all umpires can't be neutral, but there was some concern. So in 1994, there was a move to requiring one non-home umpire. And then by 2002, there was this move to two non-home umpires. So this is essentially this paper by Sarchetti et al. In 2015 is essentially sort of where our interest peaked, because we were actually interested in seeing because if there was a return sort of to the findings prior to 1994. So this particular paper, sort of doing the reverse of what we're interested in. So they exploited these changes to see if there was an impact of this move to the two non-home umpires. So they focused on the LBW decision that I've shown you, and we're going to focus on LBW decisions too, as I mentioned. So the idea was to try and separate out this sort of umpire bias from the pressure of the home crowd. So what they found is in the period prior to this rule change, they found that with two home umpires, the home team received fewer LBWs. And this had been shown by other studies. But what they saw is when there was this period when they moved to one non-home umpire, the bias was reduced and then still remained negative, but became insignificant with two non-home umpires. So effectively, first thing we were interested to see if this bias would return. But we were also interested to see if not just whether or not the bias returned, but actually we were actually expecting potentially there'd be no change to the bias, but also we wanted to see if there was potentially overcompensation, because there is this growing interest in whether revealing bias leads to some sort of corrective behaviour. And in fact, psychologists in particular are interested in this sort of overcompensation. So when you're told about bias and people are aware of this, do they overcompensate so as not to be biased, sort of swinging the other way? So there is one paper that we're aware of in the sporting context that looks at whether revealing bias can reduce bias. And this is a Popenel 2018, who found, who were looking specifically at racial bias in basketball in the NBA. I don't know anything about basketball, so I don't know what decisions they were looking at. But a paper by Price and Waters in 2010 had found that there was a clear racial bias of referees. And this paper received a lot of attention in the media. And Pope were exploiting the fact that the results of this paper were well known, and then they looked to see whether or not after the media attention, was there any change? And they actually found that in the period afterwards, there was a reduction or removal of the bias. They didn't find any overcompensation, but we're interested in seeing, essentially what we want to look at is whether or not there's no bias or if there's this overcompensation. And as already mentioned, our data includes both matches behind closed doors and with crowds. So again, we will sort of be able to see if there are any differences when there are the crowds and potentially social pressure. So in terms of literature we relate to, so given, I think, you know, well, obviously I'm a little bit biased, but the sort of attractiveness of cricket data, surprisingly, there hasn't actually been that much research on the economics of cricket, or applying economics to cricket, should I say. But there are a few papers that have sort of looked at home advantage in the context of one-day internationals, domestic one-days, but little that has looked specifically at test matches. And there are a number of papers, as I've already mentioned, that have been looking at these sort of ghost games as a result of the pandemic. And some of the papers find that there is a reduction in the sort of bias. Particularly football papers are interested in looking at things like red and yellow cards, penalties, which tend to go against the away side more. And there is a reduction of this when played behind closed doors in the absence of crowds. However, there is mixed evidence on the impact of playing closed doors on home advantage, which it seems to vary across sports, countries, and even leagues within countries. So I guess our paper was sort of linked to this, but again, we're interested in sort of almost trying to understand what the rule changes can reveal about potential bias of officials in cricket. So there is a branch of literature that has looked at whether or not officials sort of favour athletes of the same nationality. Several papers have done this in football, looking at, I think, the Champions League, where there's going to be, you know, teams from different countries, but also there's a number of papers that have looked at sports with panel of judges, which I think is quite nice, because there will be the judges themselves will be from a range of nationalities, as will the athletes, so you'll be able to see whether a judge is generous or harsh in their scoring, and then be able to look relative to how they score athletes that share their nationality. Okay, so what data do we have? So we obtained scorecard data from Cricket Archive. As I mentioned, they have a ridiculous number of scorecards dating back to the 1800s, and they have a number of scorecards at all sorts of levels. But we just have information on test matches and one-day internationals. We obtained information about technology, the DRS, from Cricinfo, where we also obtained information about umpires' nationality. Fortunately, the information that we have at the moment is sort of scraped from the notes on Cricinfo. So it's difficult to distinguish exactly when these things took place. It basically lists if a review was made, which team made the review, who the umpire was, and whether or not the decision was overturned or not. So essentially we have aggregate level information at the match level rather than by innings and innings. So we are focusing on the period November 2017 to September 2021. So we didn't want to go too far back because we wanted to try and keep our sort of comparison group, our pre-pandemic group, sort of as close to the pandemic as we could, to ensure that we're sort of comparing like with like. So we actually start from November 2017 because there were changes to the DRS system in November 2017. So originally for test matches, teams had 2 referrals per innings, but at 80 overs, these were refreshed. So there's quite a lot of, as you're heading towards 80 overs, teams would sort of punt a sort of unrealistic referrals. So therefore they had a limit of just 2, but they introduced the rule that if the decision that was referred was umpire's call, they would retain that referral, so they wouldn't lose it. Whereas prior to 2017, if it was umpire's call, they would have lost the referral. So our pre-pandemic period is therefore November 2017 to March 2020, when cricket was suspended, and then our pandemic period is July 2020 up until where we last scraped the data in September 2021. So there has been some test matches since, including several. One finished today and one started today. And again, there are still local umpires being used, so there will be a chance for us to extend this period. So we're interested in 2 outcomes: the probability of a home win. And we're just going to look at a simple linear probability model for this, and we're also going to focus, as I've mentioned, and it's probably our dependent variable of interest, is the number of LBWs. So we've used a Poisson estimator to estimate this, given it is a count, and we feel Poisson will give a better fit. So as mentioned, we're going to compare to one-day internationals, and remember that one-day internationals had a slightly different pre-pandemic norm. They had that one home umpire and one non-home umpire. So to capture teams' relative strengths, we use Elo Ratings. So we're going to use the predict, which will predict the likelihood of the home team winning, or when we're looking at innings, the team batting. So the Elo Ratings were developed for chess players, and effectively are just, these get updated after every match. We've effectively used the whole history of test matches and one-day internationals to estimate these for teams. So we opted to use these rather than simply batting and bowling team fixed effects. We also include a venue fixed effects. We opted to use venue fixed effects rather than simply host country fixed effects, because the conditions might vary not only within countries but also across venues. And we've also included combined umpire experience, because remember, one of the rationales for including an extra referral was as a result of concerns about reduced umpire experience. So this doesn't actually prove to be significant. So we exclude matches that are played on neutral ground, given there won't be a home team to favour or not favour, depending on what we're finding. And as mentioned, because we're using venue fixed effects, we therefore rely on the venue appearing at least once in our data. So any matches played at a venue that only appear once, we excluded, but these all occurred pre-pandemic. Of the neutral matches, one of these matches was the Test Championship between New Zealand and India, which was played at Lord's in England, and Afghanistan don't play at home. So for one-day internationals, so there are 12 test playing nations. So because we wanted the one-day internationals to be reasonably comparable, we only use one-day internationals that took place between test playing nations, because one-day internationals are played by a wider set of countries. One-day internationals vary a little bit more in terms of whether they have 1 or 2 non-home umpires prior to the pandemic, and whether or not and hence we kept it simple, and we only include those who have 2 home umpires through the pandemic, or who have the 1 non-home, 1 home umpire pre-pandemic. And we only include one-day internationals that also were completed, because in some cases the weather might have interrupted and prevented the one-day internationals from being completed. Okay, so just a quick preview of the raw statistics. So here I've separated out the pre-pandemic and then the pandemic. I've separated out closed doors and crowds. So here we're interested in home wins, and there is a clear, but for tests there is a clear fall in the probability or the proportion of home wins, and particularly behind closed doors. The second column just excludes draws, because in cricket it is possible to get a draw in test match cricket if the game is not completed within the allotted 5 days. One-day internationals, we actually saw an increase in the proportion of home wins. You should also see we've included the umpires' experience, and as the ICC were concerned about, you can see there is a drop in umpires' experience during the pandemic, less so for one-day internationals. And remember, in one-day internationals prior to the pandemic, they were allowed 1 local umpire, so it makes sense that they would likely have more experience, because you can see there's very little difference in the combined experience between the 2 formats in the pre-pandemic period. So in terms of average LBWs, and so this is per innings. So when we look at obviously the probability of a home win, this is at match level. This is at innings level. So remember, in tests there's up to 4 innings, 2 innings aside. I can't remember if I mentioned that. I might have forgotten to mention that. So just in case I forgot to mention that, in tests you play over 4 innings. So each team will bat twice, and therefore the aim is to score more aggregate across your 2 batting innings than your opposition. Whereas in one-day internationals, there's only 2 innings, 1 per side. So 1 batting innings per side. So in tests, pre-pandemic, we saw more LBWs award. And remember here, this is where we have non-home umpires. So more LBWs were awarded to the away side than the home side. So these are actual dismissals, because of course an LBW can be given and overturned by the technology. So these refer to the final dismissals. So we can see this is significant. During the pandemic, behind closed doors, sort of similar pattern. But what is interesting, and sort of grabbed our attention, is in front of crowds, it's the reverse. More LBWs are awarded to the home side relative to the away side. So there could be many reasons why, pre-pandemic, the away side might have more LBWs. So we will need to, and it might relate to strengths or team strengths, playing in unfamiliar conditions, for example. In terms of one-day internationals, there are fewer LBWs anyway, but we actually have the sort of reverse. So it's not statistically significantly different, but more home LBWs relative to away pre-pandemic, and then more away during the pandemic. Okay, so first of all, we simply wanted to look at the probability of a home win. And we can clearly see that during the pandemic, there was a reduction in the probability of home win. And here we've controlled for team strengths and venue fixed effects. And we can see that the size of the coefficients slightly larger behind closed doors than under crowds. So one might argue that there is a bit more social pressure from crowds. And so, but we can see that there's not much going on in the one-day internationals. So we did see a little bit in the raw statistics, but once we've controlled for strengths and venue fix effects, we can see very little effect. And that's really what we were expecting. We didn't think there would be as much change to one-day internationals, to these relegation change relative to tests, where the officials are arguably have more of an impact on outcome. Their decisions will have more of an impact, and of course the game goes on is much longer. Okay, so in terms of LBWs, because we've seen that there's this fall in home wins, so we want to try and understand what's driving this. And again, these are really preliminary results, and we really need to start thinking more deeply, about how we can sort of get at what's going on. But if we look at the LBWs, so we have our home team batting. So remember, this is at innings level. So if the home team is batting, and there is fewer LBWs awarded or given and confirmed, remember the technology can overturn them, for the home team batting. There are fewer LBWs given during the pandemic period. Maybe this relates to the rule change about not being able to spit on the ball, or relates to preparation, or again, something we need to think about. But the interesting thing is the effect of home team when played in front of crowds. This is a huge effect because it overrides this negative effect of fewer LBWs being awarded. So therefore, during the pandemic, when matches were played in front of crowds, the home team were given more LBWs. So this could fit with our sort of overcompensation story. So the argument would be that umpires are aware of, the sort of, because previously there had been non-home umpires, so there would be this idea that maybe local umpires would favour the home side, when they're playing in front of the crowds, there'll probably be, the social pressure, so they'll be probably even more aware of not being seen to be favouring one side or the other, particularly the home side. So therefore, there might be some overcompensation going. So this is consistent with this argument. Now, the one-day internationals, they had the sort of opposite. So when the home team's batting, more LBWs are awarded to home side. It's not statistically significant, but it's still a reasonable coefficient. But when they're playing crowds, this is reduced. So this might sort of, when you've got the two home umpires, it suggests that maybe they are back to favouring the home side. But there could be all sorts of things going on. So again, this is really preliminary research. This just summarises, I think, what I've said. So the first thing we thought, okay, so we've got this result that we've seen a fall in the probability of winning, and we've seen this, what we think is an interesting result, that for those matches played in front of crowds, when there's two local umpires, there's almost a swing in terms of LBWs now being more LBWs being awarded to the home side. So the first thing to do is then have a look at the technology. Can in terms of how many decisions were overturned. Can this tell us anything about what might be going on? So, as I mentioned, we've got some information. Now, the problem we have is during the pandemic, the number of reviews has increased by 1. Here, we're just specifically looking at tests. So we know it's gone from 2 to 3, and we can see that in terms of the number of reviews have clearly increased. It might be that teams are doing more punts. Well, I don't really think it's out, but we'll give it a go. And teams sometimes have a tendency, if there's a very good player at the crease, particularly the bowling side, or a player is really important when they're batting, to use the reviews on those players. So therefore, to account for this, we've simply looked into, we've done a percent. So in terms of all reviews, this is the percent overturned relative to the number of reviews. So during the pandemic, there's been fewer decisions overall overturned, slightly more umpires call, but particularly when the bowling side is reviewing. So when the bowling side is reviewing, that means that the decision has been given not out. Whereas when the batting side is reviewing, this means the decision has been given out. So this means that there's been an increase in close calls that haven't been given, that the bowling side have reviewed. Now, when I mentioned this to my husband, who plays village cricket and does a little bit of umpiring, his actual initial instinct was actually, he wasn't surprised by this, because he thinks that if you've got local umpires, they will have more knowledge about the pitches. So because there's this sort of margin of error, they think that the local umpires will have a better idea of what out's what not out. So you'll end up with more umpires calls. This was his initial instinct. So if we then break this down by the home and away team, we can actually see that during the pandemic, there's actually been a reduction in the number of decisions that have been overturned in favour of the home side. So this suggests that there are fewer mistakes made that go against the home side, because the idea is if there's a mistake, you ask the third umpire to have a look and get the decision overturned. Whereas there has been an increase in the percent overturned by the away team. So this goes against the sort of idea that maybe umpires are over compensating that our previous results potentially showed. So effectively, this is where we're at. We can see that there has been an increase in umpires call, but no real difference between the home and away side. So we're slightly puzzled at the moment about what's going on at the moment, because essentially we've got this sort of reduction in home side. We can see that there's an increase in LBWs relative, for the home side, but our information on our technology doesn't tell necessarily the same story. So therefore, we need to start thinking about, okay, what do we need to do next? What sort of things do we need to check? And start to really think, are we looking at the right thing? Are we looking at the right outcomes? So therefore, suggestions and feedback are going to be very welcome. So I will stop the slides now, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Jed asks in the chat, is there any effect on the total number of dismissals rather than the total number of LBWs, particularly in limited overs cricket? It could be the case that it's more or less likely that the batting team gets to the 50 over restriction rather than losing 10 wickets.
That's not something we checked, but that's something definitely worth looking into. Thank you for that.
And Peter says, in count data, the Poisson model requires the mean and variance to be the same. If the data has over-dispersion, a more general technique is the negative binomial. The Poisson model is nested in the negative binomial model.
Yes, so the mean and the variance are quite close. Yeah, we check that.
Great, and then two of the people that you cite have got their hands up. So Ian, actually Ian Gregory Smith first. They're both called Ian as well. So.
Hi Sarah, it's Ian here.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
So I was wondering about the umpires. Do you know who they are? The ones that have overturned the decisions?
Yes, we do, but I haven't yet been able to use that data. But that is something that I wonder
so
how.
You've been able to identify from the text in the Crick info chat, like which umpire is which, and.
Yes, so in the notes where we've got every time there's a review, it tells you which umpire made the review. So we have that information, but what we haven't been able to do yet is go to the ball by ball data and look at the decisions that weren't reviewed.
Okay. So so potentially you could have a look at a little closer detail in terms of the matching between the decision and the particular umpire who was giving it. Thinking about like how much experience they have, because you mentioned there was a big drop in experience. And
yes.
Yeah. And then the people in the DRS, do you know about them too? Or do you know the DRS people? Are they home people or are they neutral?
Oh, you mean I have got the information on television match official. So you mean the person, the third umpire?
Yeah. I mean,
yes.
it might not matter too much, but
I believe. Yes, I believe that they also are home as well. But I've got all that information. I just haven't. So prior to pandemic, that won't be the case.
Yeah. Okay.
But yes, we do have that information. But when I was looking at a few matches earlier, the test going on today, because I was just checking if the nationalities were all the same. Even the match referee in the India-New Zealand one is also Indian. So all of the officials are in Indian.
Yeah, I guess compared to when I was looking at this years ago, you got much better data now on like DRS, because it's not just the LBW decisions that are DRS. There's other ones as well. So yeah, you could have a look to see if there's any differences between the different types of DRS decisions and whether that's varied in your sample period as it's moved from home umpires. Yeah, neutral umpires to home umpires. And then the other thought was it your intention that you were going to use the ODIs as a control relative to the tests?
That was
because the tests have been treated to a larger extent. Was that?
Yeah, that was the basic idea. Sorry, I'm just
okay. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that was the general idea, but whether or not that they're that comparable might be a matter of discussion.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Ian Gregory Smith. Ian Preston had his hand up. It's gone down again. Though. I don't know if Ian Preston, you had a question?
That was an accident. No, I didn't mean to. I do one thing I'd say now that you have asked me. There was a change in the umpire's call rule in April, wasn't it? Is that in your data, where the bails were taken into the area where umpire's call applied?
I don't think I was aware of that. Yeah, thank you for raising that. I'll check that.
That's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, it's Carl. Yeah, completely forgot about that. It's true though.
Yeah, I would check that out. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks to both Ians. More questions and comments? Rob Simmons.
Let me unmute myself there. Thanks, Sarah. Interesting stuff. The question I have is fairly broad, and I don't know if you can answer it, but with all these papers on social pressure, it's very difficult to separate out what the officials are doing from the players. So is there any evidence that the players, for example, if they're faced with a system environment where they're potentially getting more LBW decisions, do they actually play, to bowl to get the LBW decisions, as opposed, for example, to bowling outside the stumps to, I've got this right, get the batsman to edge the ball for a catch? Do the players respond differently to these changing conditions is really what I'm after.
That's a very good question. And I think the only way we could get at that would be probably to get the ball by ball data and then analyse that, though it wouldn't be easy. Because then we could actually see if there are, but again, that would be a lot of work, I think.
So actually, thinking about it, it's not that much work because it's over or around the wicket, isn't it? So in cricket, for everybody who doesn't know, you can choose whether to bowl from one side of the wicket or not, and that affects your likelihood of getting an LBW decision.
So yeah, we could certainly do the text analysis. Yeah.
Okay, Jed was next.
Yeah, I have an idea. I don't know whether this would be possible, but I wonder if you're interested in sort of the awareness of bias. I wonder whether you could look at sort of the dynamics of decisions within an innings. So I'm thinking about a situation maybe where the umpire, is asked to, the umpire's decision is reviewed by DRS, and then whether that decision is upheld or overturned, whether that affects their subsequent decisions. You can kind of think of a situation where an umpire, their bias is, affected within the innings because their decision is overturned by DRS, and then you could see whether that affects their subsequent decisions. I don't know if that would be possible, but yeah, just something that I was thinking about during the presentation.
No, I think that sounds, if it's possible, that sounds quite nice. Because we know that technology itself, and you didn't see in the video, one of the videos has shown they were discussing how technology has changed umpires making decisions. So I can see that certainly as a possibility. But thank you for that. That's a nice suggestion.
Thanks, Jed. Carl, you had your hand up. Was that just to respond to the previous point? Yeah, sure. Any more questions and comments? That's very quiet. I don't back my own cricketing knowledge to submit any particularly interesting questions. So I think at that point, unless there are any late hands being raised, we'll wrap up. So thank you very much, Sarah. Really interesting talk. Lots of depth and detail on the game of cricket for those of us not familiar. And a really interesting discussion, really interesting work looking at all these different aspects of the COVID pandemic on the game of cricket. So thank you again for that. Next week we have Dominic Schreier giving a talk. So Dominic has been undoubtedly one of the biggest proponents of the Roses series throughout its entire time, faithfully tweeting every week on Twitter, sharing information, promoting it, and helping us to get lots of awareness of the series. So undoubtedly a big part in the success of these series, and we're delighted therefore that Dominic is going to give a talk next week on volleyball demand across different distribution channels. So as well as Dominic giving a talk, he'll also give us the first volleyball talk of these series as well. So do join us next week for that. And in the meantime, I do wish you all a fantastic weekend. So thanks again, Sarah. Thanks, Carl. And everyone, see you soon. Bye-bye.